started in a minute. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Turned into a sunny day, so I appreciate those who are attending. But and yeah, we'll just start as soon as we start the YouTube live streaming, Kevin. Okay. I think
you can see my slides, okay? Val?
Yeah, looks good. Yeah.
Okay.
We're live.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Occ-COVID Conversations, Health Impact Lessons and 2024 Workplace Choices. This webinar is called Managing Mask Madness, Benefits, Challenges and Solutions. So really we want to talk about the key tool in the fight against aerosol hazards, but much maligned and misunderstood. And we want to review the latest research controversy and the new CSA standards. So we wanted to run this webinar because there's a revision to CSA Z 94.4 selection, use and care of respirators. So I've just provided in the title slide up the top corner there. But, you know, respiratory protection is only one piece of protection in a layered approach. And so I've just put the infographic in there, close the gaps. We all know that respirators are much more superior than surgical masks. And this is an infographic just to show that, you know, that have much better protection. N95 fit tested respirators provide, and even elastomerics provide even better protection as well. So it only works right if the fit is tight. You know, we've had a number of surges of COVID, and you know, the next pandemic could be around the corner, but this pandemic certainly isn't over. You know, the most important thing is respirators provide both personal protection and source control. So that's an important piece of our toolkit. I just provided some hyperlinks to, you know, where you can go back to past webinars. We've run lots and lots of webinars. And if you think about the 11th being the 4th anniversary of the pandemic, you know, being announced as a pandemic, and here we are 4 years later. We've provided lots of sessions through OCAO, and I just want to introduce our speakers. The first speaker is Dr. Mark Ungrin, who's into interdisciplinary biomedical research. He's a researcher and associate professor at the University of Calgary. And it's really wonderful to have Dr. Simon Smith back again. He's a respirator science. And just if you look at the slides, you know, I'll talk about the publication that Mark was part of in a minute. But also, I want to add that it's so important that with this new standard out for public comment, for people on the call to actually have a look at the draft standard and provide public comment back. And that's just where you go to get the draft standard. So just to start off with Simon Smith, you look at how many different committees that Simon's in. And, you know, he's the chair of the Canadian Standards Biological Aerosols Working Group. That's been very active, that's fed into the standard. And I just want to make mention that he's also a recipient of the Canadian Standards Association Award of Merit. And this is kind of some of the background behind that outstanding award. And, you know, Dr. Simon Smith is retired, and he puts a huge amount of time into his volunteer work. So we're all very grateful for that. And we've also been very active, many of us, Simon, Mark and I, critiquing a study by Loeb et al. And you can actually look at all of the comments. There's 25 comments against this paper. And I just put a comment here from Dr. Lisa Brosseau talking about the study being an ethical study without a control. We did provide a letter to the editor of the editor-in-chief of Annals of Internal Medicine, and our concerns were ethical issues, lack of interdisciplinary involvement, study design results, and the dangers of misinterpreting the results of the study. And they're all the names of the people that signed up against this letter that went to the chief editor. Now, just want to go to this article. Masks work, distorting science to dispute the evidence doesn't. And it's just really important that you can have a look at this and just talk about the forces behind, you know, saying that surgical masks are equivalent to N95 respirators, which they aren't. So if you look at the authors in this article, we've had Matthew Oliver before, we've had Joe Vipon before, and now we've got Mark Ungrin, who's one of the co-authors to this article. So what I might do now is stop sharing, and if I can, stop sharing. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
I'm just trying to stop sharing. Okay, there we go. Stop sharing. All right. So what I might now do is hand you all over to Dr. Mark Ungrin, and we're all very grateful for you to spend time with us, Mark, and I'll hand it over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that intro, and that was a perfect lead-in. I will just now figure out if I can share my screen. There we go. Okay, so hopefully you can see my title slide there. And yeah, that was a really kind of perfect lead-in because you know, when I was asked to come on, one of the things I didn't want to do is kind of step into this space where there's so much expertise on you know, the technical and functional aspects of the masks and N95s and all kinds of PPE, you know, it's a little intimidating. But what I thought I would do is look at the science, because that is my specialty, around, you know, how exactly did we get here, right? How is it that we're in this situation where, you know, we just saw all those different awards and qualifications and expertise and everything that Simon's involved in, and I saw, I think it said vast amount of expertise on that award page. So how is it that we have all these people with this vast amount of expertise and information and understanding of PPE and how it works, and there's any sort of debate? Because there doesn't seem to be any dispute among the people who actually know what they're talking about. And this is an area that I've been, I mean, I guess, you know, specifically this part interested in through the pandemic, but I have a long-standing interest in rigor, reproducibility, and efficiency in science, right? I kind of think of a science lab as a machine for turning resources and funding into new knowledge. And it's always been of interest to me to understand how we can do that efficiently. And so, of course, you know, rigor of science, if you waste money on bad science, or even, you know, you can even go in a negative direction by misinforming people. So yeah, I'm going to focus particularly on that part. So, you know, why is there so much misinformation around about PPE and protection, respiratory protection, and how do we fix the situation? So, yeah, where's it come from? So often we associate the problem with this sort of anti-vax position, right? Anti-vax, anti-mask, and you know, there's definitely a lot of that out there, but that part's actually easier to deal with as it's fairly widely recognized. But the more dangerous kind of misinformation and disinformation is what appears to come from the public's perspective, from sort of inside the house, where it's disguised as if it were science, right? And so that's both directly bad, because obviously it's wrong information, but also it erodes trust in scientific approaches overall, because ultimately people discover that, well, actually, you know, what we were told was quote unquote the science yesterday turns out to be wrong. And so I think, to my mind, it's really important to try and put some daylight between some of the things that are pushed as scientific but actually aren't, and then, you know, really rigorous scientific efforts. So a critical distinction that I'd really like to see everyone make is between the medical literature and the scientific literature. So this is a quote from Dr. Marcia Angel, who was, I believe, the first female editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine. And that is really, it's the the oldest and one of the most prestigious medical journals out there. So this is not just some random quote I've picked off of Twitter, right? This is pretty authoritative. And I always tell my students not to read things off slides, but I feel like I should read this quote just because it's so critical. It is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published, or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reached slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as an editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. And that's a pretty wild statement when you think about it. But particularly over the last couple of years, I've really come to the conclusion that it's true. Now, institutional medicine, there we go, yeah, Rose, has a very different culture, structure, and training from science and engineering and so on. And one of the critical pieces of that is there isn't an effective mechanism to make a kind of a high status MD reconcile their positions with the evidence. And that's was really kind of surprising to me. If you look at engineering, for instance, if you have the most senior engineer in the province and a new junior EIT engineer in training finds an error in their math, they don't agree to disagree, right? Yet the senior person doesn't get to say, well, I'm going to build the bridge my way, and you're just going to have to keep working at it to convince me, right? There are mechanisms in place that force a reconciliation of that position with the evidence. And the mechanisms are different, but they exist across, science, engineering, law, like a whole bunch of different fields. But after some conversations, even with some very senior people within medicine, those mechanisms don't really exist within, again, institutional medical hierarchies. I'm not talking about, your family doc here, right? But the people that get to positions of power and the constraints on how they can use that power. And there really aren't a lot, which again was just sort of stunning to me from a scientific perspective. And this carries over into publishing. So you'll find stuff in the medical journals that just would not fly in serious scientific journals. Like, yeah, okay, you can find everything in the fringe journals, but the kind of stuff you'd only find in the fringe in science winds up in fairly major medical journals. And I want to emphasize, I'm not saying like everything in the medical journals is junk, right? There's a lot of really good work in there as well. But the problem is there's not a lot of quality control. So you can get stuff published because it's great, but you can also get stuff published because you know the right people. And again, there's, I'm not saying that's not a problem in science, but as you'll see from some of the examples I'll show you in a moment, it's a really serious issue in medicine. So here's one representative example. So you've probably heard a lot of talk over the last few years about harms of respirators and masks and so on. And this is one paper that is pretty widely cited on that. So the title here, Respiratory Consequences of N95s in Pregnant Healthcare Workers. And it's a clinical trial, right? And with all the paperwork and expenses and all this stuff that really kind of comes with running a clinical study. And they reported, interestingly, harm was not demonstrated, although that part often gets left out from where it's cited. But talking about significant changes to respiratory physiology caused by breathing through an N95 mask materials, right? And the materials part is important, you'll see in a moment, but also lost in translation. When it's cited, nobody talks about mask materials. They're saying N95s are harmful to pregnant healthcare workers. Widely cited, including in this key publication back in 2020 by the group that WHO policy was really relying on the advice from, arguing against the precautionary principle and use of respirators. And citations are all down the bottom if someone wants to follow up later. So, okay, interfering with respiratory function, that seems pretty serious, right? Well, how did they do that? Well, that's their experimental setup, right? So even without everyone's microphones turned on, I can almost feel like the cringe coming in through the windows. So this is what they did is they took this tight-fitting mask with a spirometer on the end. So all the air is flowing through this black thing on the end here with a little turbine inside. They cut a little piece out of a mask. Or an N95 respirator. Looks from the label up here, or from the piece of the label, you can see it's a 3M 1860 or 1860S. And you can see I've highlighted in the text here, this is taken from their paper, simulating the actual wearing of an N95 respirator. Now, I got in touch with the manufacturer for the dimensions of that spirometer. I did a little bit of image analysis with ImageJ to figure out how much of it's covered in tape. And obviously, we only have the one picture, so it's not like a high-end value experimental system or anything. But there's about 12.5 square centimeters there, and the original mask, it'll vary a little bit depending on where the contact points on the face are of the wearer, but you're looking at about 150 square centimeters for the full 1860 on someone's face. So this experimental setup is a 10-fold reduction in available surface area, and I should thank, by the way, Connor Richicki for kind of finding this originally. He's the one that initially kind of pointed this out and wound up bringing it to my attention. But the net result of this is, because you're forcing all the air through this very small piece of surface area, in terms of resistance, it's like wearing 10 N95s, one on top of one another, and all of them well sealed, right? We've got tape around the edges of the piece of material, and then where the actual mask fits on the wearer's face, it's a elastomeric. So it's a 2015 paper, cited 79 times as of this morning. I just checked, and 73 of those include the term COVID. So essentially, it's a paper that was produced. It kind of sat there in the literature, and nobody did much with it. And then it's just taken off in terms of citations in terms of COVID, and it's cited as evidence that the breathing resistance of N95s causes physiological harm, or at least changes in physiological parameters, to pregnant women. And you can see, like, it just doesn't make any sense at all. There's a link to the Google Scholar if anybody wants to kind of dig into those citations of it. There's a lot more examples like this. So, I mean, Kevin kind of mentioned already the big three paper, like the LOA 2022 study on N95s versus medical masks, but there were a couple of previous studies as well, and the three of those together are often used to argue that respirators aren't better than medical masks in quote unquote real world situations. All three of those had protocols designed as intermittent use, right? So you walk into the room, you get within 3 feet of the aerosol source, and then you switch from a medical mask to an N95 respirator. And, right off the bat, that just tells you that there wasn't a lot of expertise in, respiratory protection involved in the design of these studies, right? You can't imagine, somebody in some kind of industrial process where they walk into the room 3 feet away from the source and then put on their PPE, right? It just doesn't work that way. But nevertheless, this is viewed as authoritative. One paper we've been dealing with recently, not directly related to PPE, but they claimed that PCC, so post-COVID condition or long COVID, is extremely rare in children. And you can see from the quote here, it says, met the WHO PCC definition. And then we've sent in a letter and they replied. And in their reply, they admitted, we would have asked about the 24 symptoms listed in this long COVID definition, but they didn't come out until after our study was finished. So there's a direct statement that they made claims in the paper, and they never even collected the data necessary to assess whether those claims are true or false. And in any kind of field that I've been involved in, that would be a slam dunk retraction, right? Just over and done with. It's demonstrably false. That's the end. We're done. And not only was there no retraction, the journal actually played all kinds of games. If you go and have a look at it, their paper, which was widely covered in the media, is open access. Our letter and their response are hidden behind the paywall. They screwed around with our title after we had approved final page proofs. And just an unbelievable experience that, for me would be, I might expect something like that from a really fringe scientific journal, but none of the mainstream journals would behave like that. But this is JAMA Pediatrics and the JAMA Network, which really is, pretty well recognized name in the field. And it just goes on, right? Like, I could spend hours on this. So again, I've got the citations at the bottom if people want to dig into that further. But it raises the question of how this happens, right? Like, how do we get to this place where, again, and I really want to make the point that I'm not saying that everything in the medical journals is bad, right? There's some really good work in there. The problem is that the system lacks these quality control methods, particularly for influential submitters. And so you can get really good things in the medical literature, but you can also get, like I said, stuff that you wouldn't see in the scientific literature outside the fringe literature. And a big part of the problem is this idea of a hierarchy of evidence, right? So this is actually taken from a World Health Organization, guideline development document. And a lot of you probably kind of run into this before. And, we can go, again, we could kind of talk for hours about what does and does not work within the evidence-based medicine hierarchy. But part of the problem is that evidence-based medicine, it's a subjective policy on how to take shortcuts in interpreting science. So it's useful under the right circumstances, but the idea is that, you've got a clinician, the time is limited, the resources are limited, they need to make some decisions. And so it's sort of a guideline to say, well, yeah, you don't have to learn the entire literature on everything, just sort of follow these guidelines and you'll get a kind of quick and dirty answer. And there's still debate about, so Dr. Greenhall and others have put some really great work out on, EBM plus, right? The idea that maybe it needs a little bit of tweaking even within that kind of intended application. But where we've hit a real problem is that it's been emphasized so much that this pyramid is critical, this is the way you have to decide, that people are graduating from these programs with believing that this is actually how science works, right? So not understanding that it's a heuristic, it's a shortcut, but actually thinking this defines the relative value of evidence from different sources. And it's just, there's no scientific basis for that, right? It's a policy that was adopted, and again, people even disagree internally about policy, but it's just a policy. And focusing in specifically, so up at the top here, we've got this kind of filtered evidence. From a scientific perspective, that's not evidence, right? Like when we run a PhD examination, the student kind of comes in and has to answer all the questions and everything. And what we tell them is the general stuff, know the textbook. Things that are getting, around your area of expertise, yeah, okay, reviews are useful there. But once we get to the hardcore of what you're supposed to know for your PhD, primary literature, there's no substitute. The reviews and that sort of thing are useful in the sense that it helps you find things in the primary literature and put it in context a bit. But primary literature is evidence, secondary, no. I put meta, maybe, like meta-analyses can arguably be considered primary literature because they do combine data from multiple papers and things, but you have to be really careful because there is a lot of opportunity for someone to put their thumb on the scales. And so, yeah, there's conceivably true, but in practice, a lot of them I don't see as super rigorous. Down at the bottom, this idea of putting animal and laboratory studies, there's no scientific basis for placing that there in the discussion of broader science. Debatably, it is useful as a shortcut, right? Like you don't want a frontline clinician going out reading a paper about mice and then inventing their own antibiotic dosing schedule or something. But nevertheless, yeah, the idea that somehow there's this ranking that's objectively true for science as a whole is just, there's no basis in reality for that. And then even within the ranking, methods do not override research quality. So randomized controlled trials are, people say gold standard, and tend to kind of argue that means if you have a randomized controlled trial, you can ignore everything below that. And again, that's, again, potentially useful as a heuristic, as a shortcut, but from a scientific perspective, no. You take all the evidence into account, and you may have done a randomized controlled trial, but if it's a terrible trial, then it has less evidentiary value than other aspects of this. And I'll just point out, like if you go down the bottom of the pyramid, in the second from the bottom, we've got narrative reviews, expert opinions, editorials, right? And you see that above animal and laboratory studies. And that is almost the original sin of the pandemic, from my perspective, is that there are significant numbers of people out there who legitimately believe, based on the training that they have received, that an expert opinion or an editorial from someone inside the EBM bubble is actually of greater value than the entirety of animal and laboratory studies that have ever been completed. And so if you look back to the original rejection of the evidence on aerosol transmission at the World Health Organization, that I think is really what happened there, is that the people, receiving the evidence really felt like they were experts in their own minds. That meant that their opinions outweighed the entirety of the work done by these expert researchers in the bioaerosol space. So the last slide then, what can we do about this, right? And I would encourage people to get involved. So an MD is not the same thing as a PhD. It's not better, it's not worse, but the training is very different. And it's often kind of, I guess, sold to the public that and people outside academia in particular, that it's too complicated for you to understand. Just do what you're told, right? And I would say, don't go there, right? Like, if you see those images I showed from the clinical trial on the N95 mask material with a tiny little circle cut out of it, right? There's nothing complicated about what was wrong with that paper, right? If you have a fairly basic background in this, you can really go through and you can often find some significant failings in some of this work that's been used as a foundation for policy. So the idea that it's too complicated for you is really like, people try and claim ownership about this. Don't think about this. Don't criticize my choices, my decision. But yeah, there's no basis for that. You'll often hear the term epistemic trespass, right? The idea of stepping into someone else's area of expertise and telling them how it works. And that's used, again, to kind of shut down debate. But I think it's really useful to make a distinction between what I call authoritarian epistemic trespass. So that's if I step into your space and I tell you, I know how this works. I'm right, you're wrong, stay out of my way. The other option is inquisitive epistemic trespass, right? So where you kind of step into the space respectfully, but ask questions and try and understand what's going on. And that's where, it's not for me to step into the cockpit of an airplane and suddenly tell the pilot, you should be doing it this way. But it's okay for me to look out the window and say, hey, are we really supposed to be flying straight at this mountain, right? So if you see suspicious research, right, if you see something cited that says, talking about these ridiculous harms from N95s that everyone's going to, drop dead in 10 minutes after putting one on, and or toxic levels of CO2 and all kinds of things, look into it yourself and speak up about it. Don't be intimidated. Don't feel like the people doing these studies must know much more than you do about this. Again, especially in the medical literature, the people doing the study may not have any more advanced science training than you do, right? So really, feel confident. Make sure, know yourself, right? Know your own limitations. Don't repeat the errors we've seen in the pandemic where people just kind of overconfidently start stomping all over things. But yeah, regardless of your background, like I said, so these failures that we're seeing are not, some of them are quite technical and complex, but many of them are quite straightforward. And the other piece of that is there's just so much junk out there that we really need your help. There's a bandwidth limitation. Individuals like myself who are kind of faculty and trained in this area, there's a certain amount we can do, but there's only so many hours in the day. So it's really valuable to have community involvement in this kind of digging into the questionable claims and highlighting areas where there's real problems. So I will end there and stop sharing. Oh, and I saw Dorothy has posted a link to a paper. Yeah, that's a thank you. That's a really great paper.
Thanks, Dr. Mark Ungrin. What we might do is just leave questions to the end, if that's okay, because
Sure.
that way we give Simon lots of time to speak as well. Just really want to, on behalf of a lot of people from OCO and others, other coalition members of the Canadian Aerosol Transmission Coalition, just really thank you for your knowledge and science activism and your leadership in this area. You know, it's so important that we can all work together on this. So thanks so much for spending the time, and we'll get to questions after Simon's spoken. So
Thank you very much.
what can we all do together? There is actually a link in the chat box to the new draft standard, and I think it would be great if after this webinar, if people can actually take the time to look at the draft standard, understand it, and even try and make comment back. Just by going through it and looking at it and making comment back, you'll get a much better take on it. It's a standard for respiratory protective equipment. It's been around for a long time. It's involved many experts. So we really need to push this standard hard. And with that, I'll hand you over to Dr. Simon Smith. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you very much. I will just try and share the screen. Thanks. And thank you, Mark, very much for that great presentation. It's a very hard act to follow up. And I apologize. I think mine may be more on a simpler level than that, but just sharing now. And thanks. So thanks again, everyone. I hope you can see the screen. So thank you. And thank you, Kevin, for the I guess, introduction beforehand. That was rather overwhelming. Thank you. So what I'm going to be talking about is the work that's been undertaken on updating the Canadian standard for selection, use and care of respirators, and also some other work that's been ongoing. I apologize, this slide is probably going to be easy knowledge for everybody, but just to define particularly what a respirator is, because that's a specific meaning when we're using it in standards work. That is that it's something providing respiratory protection that's approved, and that process involves testing and qualification of some of the documentation and manufacturing quality and so on of the product at the manufacturer, and it's meeting national or international standards for this. Mask is a term thrown around, and that can mean just about any kind of face covering, and in the public eye there's often confusion and crossover between these. So we're talking about respirators in terms of standards right now. And again, I hope everybody who's been to the OCAR presentations before will be familiar with all of this, as we've been talking about it for several years now. But just to bring a few things in around the fundamentals of what gives good respiratory protection. We call it the 3 Fs, and the first of these is concerning the fit of the respirator. That's probably the most important one. And the product must be designed to fit, seal well to the face. There's one exception, which is the loose-fitting powered air purifying respirator, where there's an overpressure of air that provides a level of protection. But generally, for the products that have been provided and used during the pandemic, we're talking about negative pressure devices, whereas lungs provide the power for passing air through the filter, and the inhalation and exhalation has, of course, an impact on how the filter works. To work, they must seal well to the face. They must be designed to do that. Respirators selected, appropriately sized to the individual, and there's fit testing methods. A qualitative one is shown here, and quantitative, where you have an instrument that can measure particle concentrations inside and outside the face piece, and that is undertaken periodically. It's required to select a respirator properly, and needs to be repeated every 2 years under the Canadian standard, and also if there's any changes to facial features. And when a respirator is first donned, there should be a fit check, or user seal check as it's called, undertaken every time. So that's ways of ensuring good fit to the face, because whatever else the respirator does, it doesn't do anything if the air is bypassing it. Filtration is the next important feature. Again, early on in the pandemic, we heard a lot about filtration, and was the 95% quotes that N95s give you good enough and this kind of thing. But really, I'd say personally that fit is probably more important, and the filtration level actually is a bit secondary. And again, contrary to a lot of what you might hear in media and read, filtration is not like sieving. It's not like a tea strainer or a fishing net. In fact, there are multiple mechanisms, and it's mainly electrostatic charge that is involved in retaining particles on the filter media, not just sieving. There are several different mechanisms involved, and these combine overall to give protection both for small and large particles. And so there's an overall minimum level, and that's where the testing is undertaken, and that's where that 95% number comes in. One other thing I'll mention, again following Mark's comments, the laws of physics apply. And I've been involved in correspondence with a major medical journal that actually almost denied that. They were concerned that the efficiency for a particle that was infectious was different from the efficiency from a particle that was non-infectious. And in fact, of course, electrostatic charge, flow mechanisms, and that apply the same way to whatever kind of particle is involved. So, but to them, it was a big thing. And you've even heard people talking about, well, can we use an industrial respirator in a medical setting, and be concerned about the difference? Unfortunately, there isn't one. And there are multiple types of filter, not to forget gas vapor filters, a whole different category that, again, there's an awful lot of science goes into, but the ones we're concerned about in terms of protection against biological aerosols are the particle filtering types. And what's shown in the table there are the NIOSH ones. You've all heard about N95s, but actually N95 is a test category, not really a product. And it's something it's part of a matrix of different levels of protection and different types of protection that are available for products. And there's an explanation of why that's been set up, but it's more historic around technologies available when the standard was first set up, rather than what we can do now. But we have negative pressure, the ones where, again, the lungs provide the power for breathing, and we have powered air systems where a blower can apply power, and they have different requirements. And beyond fit and filtration, the one important thing also is what we might call function. And with that, is a question: how usable is the respirator? Is it easy enough to breathe through? Is it comfortable to wear? And does it allow you to do what you need to do when you're working? Can you communicate readily without removing it? Can you do your tasks, say, without dislodging the respirator off your face, or having it impede your movements too much? And these are important factors, because if you're compelled to remove a respirator for any reason to communicate or get relief, it's not actually protecting you, so it's not helping. So these things, fit, filtration, and function, are all important in the function of a respirator to ensure that it gives protection. And these are factors that we had in mind when we were updating the standard, which so I'll be referring back to some of these as we go through the talk. And I say apologies, I hope that's all familiar to everybody, but I hope it's, if not, a useful recap. When it comes to occupational health and safety regulation and standards in Canada, and again, apologies if this is familiar to everybody, but we have a very devolved system where it's primarily provincial or territorial legislation that governs health and safety in Canada, with some federal legislation for those employed by the federal government. When it comes to the appropriate standards, some of these regulations actually require the standard to be followed, others cite it as a best practice. But we have across the country approval of the equipment that employers must provide if respiratory protection is required. It has to be approved as a minimum by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health in the US, and we'll get to that in a minute, as well as when we deal with events that happened during the pandemic. There is a government body called the Standards Council of Canada that's kind of hidden away up in Ottawa, and they actually certify what are called standards development organizations. And there are several of these across Canada that define standards, and the Standards Council controls these so there's no overlap and so on, and the full spectrum of need is covered. The Canadian Standards Association is one of these, and many people think it's part of the government, but it's not. It's a separate organization, not-for-profit standards development organization, and it has coverage of occupational health and safety, actually apart from clothing, and it occupies the role in two ways. One with setting the standards and having committees that do that, and the other being in testing products. They run laboratories and evaluate products, and things like the electrical code and things are all run by CSA, so they have a range of different mandates. Say safety equipment is one of them. And then when it comes to certain medical devices, it's Health Canada that can provide approval for that. And so that actually came to be important during the pandemic. With respect to the CSA standards that apply here, we have several that are involved in the respiratory protection area, but there are only two that are significant for general workplaces. And that is the standard on selection, use and care of respirators. It's been around for about 40 plus years now. And then a very new one that came out during the pandemic, and I think many people on the call may have worked on that, called the performance of filtering respirators, and that was done because Canada needed its own standard when NIOSH wasn't available. And so I'm going to primarily be talking about the first one of these, but I'll just reference the second one because that's part of the history that we went through in the recent years. So some of these standards provide guidance on how you select and use the equipment, and the other ones there provide information on how the equipment must perform. It's a slight difference in the emphasis there. And in terms of a car, one is the sort of regulation that coverage of how you would put on a seatbelt, and the other one is what would guide a manufacturer in installing a seatbelt into the vehicle. So there's slight differences in the emphasis there, and CSA covers both of those. Just to mention, during the pandemic, there were, of course, some things we're familiar with, but many things went on in the background. We did begin with respirator shortages in healthcare, particularly. Again, we could go into why that is, and again, it's some aspects of lack of understanding of how respirators work, the need for respirators, and issues that manufacturers are never consulted when they started destroying stockpiles and that kind of thing. Canada did have a manufacturing facility for respirator filters. That's where I happened to work for 30 years. But that location did not manufacture filtering face pieces. And so we began the pandemic with no home industry for making the filtering face pieces, the disposable types. That was the sort that was most popular at the start of the pandemic. And then, of course, we had concerns over the stability of imports, because other countries were trying to conserve their stocks and manufacturers were being persuaded to send material in certain directions and so on. So it became a real concern in Canada. I should mention, in response to this, a number of new Canadian operations started up, either existing companies converting production over to respirators or new operations starting up. But these needed NIOSH approval, as every equipment has since health and safety legislation began in Canada. For use in the workplace. But then NIOSH itself was overwhelmed because they had, from the US, again, dozens of companies starting up trying to get product approved, and they changed their prioritization to favor US manufacturers. So we had a crisis that we had companies wanting to provide equipment, a strong need, and no way of getting the stuff approved. And Health Canada stepped in very promptly to allow respirators with any kind of certification to be used in healthcare specifically. And then later in 2020, they issued a specification to allow the approval of certain respirator types. They actually wrote out a set of requirements. And that covered both the performance of the product and, again, manufacturer quality. Sort of a bit like NIOSH, some differences, but that kind of filled the gap. And companies, again, could get the approval only for use in healthcare and only really covered a very limited range of products. It was basically non-powered elastomeric half and filtering face piece respirators. So the long-term solution to this was for CSA to create a new performance standard, and that would itself be part of a whole national certification process that could be used in parallel with NIOSH, again to ensure the supply of suitable, capable respiratory protection equipment into healthcare and other needs as required. And that was undertaken starting in 2020, very rapidly. Again, it's normally a 3 or 4 year process to come up with a Canadian standard, a new standard, but we did this inside a year. And so that standard was published in October 2021, and products are now being approved to this standard. And you can go on the CSA website and find the list of those. So we now have a system in place. So that was great. That helped us through the pandemic. But then we have also the standard on selection, use, and care. And there were some issues with that, I'll explain in a minute, but particularly that has to accommodate, of course, this new performance standard and deal with some of the issues that arose during the pandemic. And so that is what's in the process of being updated right now. So that's going on, and pretty much talk about that for the rest of the presentation. Just to say how CSA works, it is a very much an organizational structure that sets up committees to undertake its work. It sells standards, and it does this testing for certification of products. Standards are on a sort of time frame where they're looked over periodically, and committees revisit them to update them in terms of need and technology and so on. This is all run by volunteers, by the way, and I would say many people on this call have volunteered on standards committees, and much appreciation should be expressed towards them. And these committees have a balance of stakeholders so that you don't have an overwhelming occupation of a committee by manufacturers or by users or by a particular area of industry. It's a well-regulated balance. And so these committees meet regularly. Again, of course, Zoom has allowed us to meet extremely regularly. Historically, it was every few months. And in the work, they may call on other parties like experts in particular areas to provide input as needed. And you see along the bottom there the development stages. You may have a seed document to start a new standard, or they may review an existing version and look at the public input over the years that's been used. The committee meets and reviews this, drafts new parts of the standard as needed, and then there's a period for public comment, and then those comments are assessed and a final draft is created that's then sent round to the members of the committee for ballot, and with success then there's publication. And publication is both in English and French. And the whole process then begins again, as I mentioned, standards are reviewed periodically, and so input and comments received back from the user community. There may be surveys undertaken as well over the life of the standard that bring in this input as well. So the standards are aimed to be sort of regularly updated to match the needs and say changing technologies. With the respiratory side, we had the standard, and this is a bit confusing because they called the one for performance Z94.4.1 because the people working on it were mostly part of the Z94.4 committee that covers selection, use and care. So that was developed very quickly, supported an urgent need, and was created in the structure I talked about with a small committee and added experts. And CSA itself added the capability, added a laboratory capability to test a product to do standard certification. You can't test all kinds of product covered in the standard. They may need to go out for certain types, but at the moment, everything that's been submitted has been tested in the CSA labs. The one undergoing current update is the one on selection, use and care, and they said that's been around for just over 40 years. And it was updated in 2018 last time, and now is being revised again, should be out this year. And there were multiple working groups looking at this, different aspects of it. And we invited experts in as well, from those who've been through COVID in hospitals particularly, and then also experts in certain subject areas and bioaerosols and control banding. We have a ventilation one coming up in a couple of weeks. So it's now at the public stage. This public comment is due to end fairly soon. We've actually got a slight extension, we think, to the end of the month. But after that, the committee will review the comments, produce a final draft ballot, and then should be in mid-year. What's in the standard right now, and what will continue to be in the standard, are various features around respiratory protection programs particularly. So first of all, this is considered to be either a best practice or even required in legislation, and it covers a full range of equipment. Although we've had a big focus on the filtering face piece types and the particle respirators, it does cover all kinds of equipment up to firefighting equipment. And it addresses, again, programs, the aspects of a program such as medical clearance, hazard and risk assessment, a big area, and then quite a full area on the selection, not just for chemicals, which is a sort of approach, but also for biological aerosols. And then other aspects of equipment use. And one important one is fit testing. Has, of course, become a major issue during COVID, and the need to apply that for proper respirator use in healthcare. It was the first standard in the world, it turns out, to bring in a method for selecting respirators for biological aerosols. And this hadn't been done historically because the selection process relied on having information about toxicity on the protection factors. It brought a control banding method in that allowed the assessment on a semi-quantitative scale to be used to provide information. And we'll take a look at how that works in a minute. What we found, though, having some of us have worked on this for 20 plus years, is the fact that although in the 2011 update and subsequent updates, we were working thinking, well, this is what they're going to use when there's another pandemic, because we took a lot of what happened after SARS and built that into that 2011 version. We found that when it came to it, the standard was minimally referenced by governments or medical organizations when the pandemic was at its peak, and still isn't, or sometimes it's just cherry-picked. So it's not quite ideal. And so part of the work we're doing now is to try and improve that relevance to the healthcare community. Some key points in the update work, and say we're inviting people to review the document and comment back. So this is just sort of the highlights of what has been changed. There's some changes in fit testing, and it covers both qualitative and quantitative testing methods. There's an abbreviated fit testing protocol to speed the process that's been developed in the US that is ready for adoption here. And there's sort of more forms or form provided so to make it easier to follow the process. So that's again assisting the worker. There have been long-term concerns over the barriers to using respirators and ensuring that respirators are used where they're needed. Sometimes we call these underserved users, people who may not be in industries that are easily regulated, family businesses and so on, and small industries. And also sometimes where the legislation may require certain activities to be done, it may not always be possible for employers to do that. So there's some guidance there as well. So that's a new annex to the standard that is again, we'd like comments back on that. And the document is going to bring in more guidance for the healthcare community, recognizing the kind of lack of use. There's a section at being added to sort of guide healthcare users into which other parts of the standard to look at, and to relate some other standards, say around ventilation, and how they conform with the requirements in this standard. There's a proposal coming up to, once the standard is finalized, to create a parallel guidance document further to assist those in the healthcare community in the use of the standard and the development of respiratory protection programs and other aspects of respirator use that they may have been perhaps afraid of before. So to bring that in. So that's one key area. Then we have some changes in the respirator selection guidance. And I mentioned that this was the first standard to bring in a control banding method for respirator selection for biological aerosols. Generally, first of all, we have these new criteria, new standards within that performance standard from the developed during the pandemic. And so we need to bring those into the standard. So there's recognition of the scale there and modification of flowcharts and things to accommodate the changes there. And recognize the classifications under the Canadian system and some of the new products that now have brought in. Then we have considerations beyond protection. And very, very, very strongly to what Mark talked about with the breathability of respirators, recognizing that is a big factor in the dislike of their use. And so in the performance standard, some actually criteria were brought in to allow manufacturers to mark the products if they were capable of meeting a lower resistance than the normal minimum. And so that is being brought into as a comment there. Again, looking at comfort and also fluid resistance, which is something considered useful in healthcare. And then discussing around single or reusable respirators and choices in that case where the economics of respirator use is significant. And also we've been hearing about use of exhalation valves, or the suitability of exhalation valves in say settings where there's consideration that they release a lot of material through the valve, and so they shouldn't be used. Interestingly, when studies have been done, they find that a surgical mask allows far more release, yet probably 90% of the people you can't use the valve would allow a surgical mask to be used in the same circumstance. Yeah, so there we go. Anyhow, that's again, so there's some commentary on this and some these points raised to allow people to make decisions around selecting the appropriate respirator. On the biological aerosol side, sorry, this is a bit of a complicated slide, but it is actually just the fact that historically in the standard we had just a descriptive text around risk assessment for biologicals particularly, and this has now been changed where we propose a systematic method to go through, looking at the circumstances of the exposure and assess, again, a semi-quantitative scale, taking you through multiple questions so that some more precise decision can be made about whether or not you need a respirator and whether you need a respirator in every circumstance. So that's in there. And then also, again, research during the pandemic has been published on the so-called aerosol generating procedures. And these were the sort of things like bronchoscopies, intubation, and so on that traditionally in the medical environment, under the rules that were in place at the time, might make a difference between wearing a respirator or not. But what studies showed was that simple activities, coughing, speaking, sneezing, and so on, could create far more aerosols, sometimes by 2 orders of magnitude, than these traditional aerosol generating procedures. And so the way things were scaled in the assessment of risk and assessment of respirator selection needed to be changed. And so that's gone in here as well. Now, the other aspect on respirator use of biological aerosols is, once you've decided through the risk assessment whether you need a respirator or not, how to select the appropriate respirator. And this was, I think, traditionally people who've become familiar with the standard will know the wheels, as we call them, that aid in selection based on multiple inputs of what kind of level of protection is needed, leading you to select the appropriate respirator. And we reviewed this very extensively and brought in some changes. We tended to have, in the previous one, a distinction between 2 types of work environment on this presumption that in the healthcare facilities, ventilation was generally better than in general workplaces. Perhaps not always right. So that has been now moved to a single scale for the ventilation levels, right now based in the draft on exchange rates, but it could be changed. We want to get some expert guidance on this. We've also changed the biosafety scales. It was a 1 to 4 scale based on the laboratory biosafety classification of the nature of the microorganism involved in the biological situation. But in this case, we've recognized that in some cases that the scales that may be published are not really fully reflective of the nature of the hazard. So we expanded to a 6-level scale, and it may change as well. And then the other thing was generation rates, recognizing there are more factors that go into consideration of generation than we'd had listed before, and perhaps the density of the population generating the and so on is necessary to be considered. And so some of the descriptions have changed there. So we had a lot of discussion and say the consideration that we needed more factors on the input side. But when it came to the outputs, we also had the counter flow that there was interest in making it simpler for healthcare facilities to use. So it was quite I guess, an exercise in reconciling these two. But we have proposed slight simplification for the majority of cases. It would only recommend, say, a filtering facepiece level or a loose-fitting powered air purifying respirator as needed in healthcare. So simplifying the equipment they need to bring from a selection of 4 different choices down to 2. If it's something like an Ebola, a very high-level disease, then the full scale still applies. So those are the changes that are in that part. And just to say, the plan is to have this public review going on. It says 18th of March. I kind of heard just in the last couple of days that actually it's probably good to the end of the month, so keep sending in your review. Like I said, the input will be reviewed by the committee, and then the final draft compiled, it'll be balloted, and then publication middle of the year. We get in French as well. And let's say that we have that work plan for healthcare guidance, and if people are moved to want to assist with any of this work, please contact us here. We welcome all the help we can get. And as I noted earlier, CSA accepts comments throughout the life of the standard. So if you're using the standard in a year or 2 and still find something that you think needs to be fixed, contact CSA, and that will be considered for the next edition of the standard, or even an interim revision if need be. So thank you very much. Oh yes, so that's the web page. You'll see a section like that if you go to the link there. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks very much, Dr. Simon Smith and Dr. Mark Ungrin. Now we're up to the Q&A part of the webinar, and
Nice.
I'm just looking at the chats now. I might start with the last comment first, and we always want people to ask these questions in person, And so there's a question from Christine Guptill. I'm just wondering, Christine, would you mind asking the question yourself rather than me reading it out?
Sure, yeah. Sorry, I'm not sure why my camera's not on, but maybe it is on. Maybe you can see me. Yeah, I had two thoughts that troubled me, and I'm wondering if Dr. Smith can address whether the CSA is looking at this. I mean, I'm sure you all are aware of it, but in the healthcare environment at the beginning of the pandemic, I'm thinking of a particular situation with an outbreak, but it was the same all over as far as I could tell. But there was this language around suspected, confirmed, or probable cases. And so, you know, healthcare workers were told that if they were dealing with a suspected, confirmed, or probable case of COVID, totally ignoring asymptomatic transmission. And, you know, we certainly saw situations where there was an outbreak and, you know, there certainly probably was transmission going on because people were wearing surgical masks, but it was ascribed to inappropriate donning and doffing, and you had staff who were assigned to literally police donning and doffing of PPE. And then the other situation that I was about to add was that people in healthcare education settings. So I teach in a healthcare education setting, and I'm not fit tested. My students are. And it's very interesting because when I taught in person, and I was among the people that was teaching in person through the whole thing, you know, we were in PPE in close contact, but what we were given, of course, was surgical. So I was buying my own respirators. So.
Interesting situation. I think on the first question, it's again something that was discussed quite a lot in the committee, was sort of the trigger to make respirator use required, and what circumstances would do that. In the end, we really had to step back from that somewhat because we could not predict every situation or every way that legislation, regulation, and processes work across the country. So really, the standard is focused on describing what happens when appropriate procedures are brought in or are triggered. I know there was various opinions on this, and others on the call may have different ones, but it is something that is, I think, in our terms, we decided better to address that in this guidance document that we're going to look at, and put more descriptive wording around it in that, rather than have that in the standard itself. So sorry that yes, it has been discussed, but the standard can't really address sort of the triggers that set respirator use in motion in certain cases. I'm sorry about that.
Thank you. Thank you.
And again, as for this PPE use, again, that strikes me as common sense. But it's a tough one. Again, it's partly again a problem that you have to have the will to enforce the standard or bring the standard into use appropriately. Again, we're trying to get better education around that, but the standard itself can only sort of describe what to do. It can't always go into exactly when it has to be applied. Thanks.
Thanks, Simon. Before I go to Mark, I'm just wondering if you just provide a bit more background about the what's been incorporated in the revised standard to accommodate healthcare. And also, you talked about the guidance that's planned for healthcare as well. Did you want to expand on that a bit, if you don't mind?
Sure, can do, yes. Really, the what's in the draft, as you'll see, is Annex T. The annexes may appear in an odd order, by the way, in the draft. If you go to look at it, they will be reorganized more sensibly in the final version. It's just that they were right now just listed as written or as added. There is guidance in the document to principally guide the perhaps unfamiliar healthcare community user through the standard, advising them on which sections are important to look at, and then also bringing in some considerations around healthcare. Particularly one area is when you're using the guidance for selecting respirators and for this risk assessment, the ventilation is a consideration. There is another standard, CSAZ 317.2, which covers healthcare ventilation systems. And so we take part of that standard and bring it in so that it's easy to translate basically on what location you're working in a facility, and giving the appropriate input for the guidance protocol. That's one aspect. The other thing that's mentioned in there, and it's again something that came out in our discussions, I think, again, as originally conceived, the standard for its respirator selection was very much intended for sort of a particular work environment. You look at foundry or smelter or that kind of thing, and you can assess the location there. But there may be office areas in the such a facility you don't need a respirator, of course. With the situation of a pandemic, where you have a general situation of pre-symptomatic infection, where your co-workers may be as much of a hazard as the patients, and likewise hospital visitors, it may be better to set a general policy in a healthcare facility saying that you wear a respirator unless, as it were, and list the except. We don't mandate that in the standard, but we do suggest it's something that could be looked at. So there's sort of guidance like that as well to reverse the onus that you justify when you're not wearing a respirator rather than when you are wearing a respirator, which again, a number on the committee thought that was a good way to go forward, again, with a pandemic of this nature. So there is sort of comment on such factors as that as well. And then there's sort of general guidance in that section on using some of the selection guidance and again, more examples and protocol from the healthcare side of things rather than from the general industry side. So explaining about generation and so on. Thanks.
Thanks, Simon. I just see Barry Hunt just gave a clap to that comment. So over to you, Mark.
Yeah, so just sort of following on to that and a little bit of a question related to it as well, is, yeah, I feel like a big part of the problem has been sort of hostile compliance, right? Like the existing standard seems to sort of make the assumption that everyone's operating in good faith and wants to protect the workers, and that's the priority and everything. And I feel like a lot of the shortcomings we've run into have been people who don't really want to comply with it and finding looking for loopholes and things. And I agree, there's only so much you can do in the standard to prevent people from doing that kind of thing. But I wonder if you think it might be productive to include kind of documentation requirements. You mentioned a default assumption that you need the PPE, and if you don't, you need to justify it. Whether some of that might be addressed by having specific record keeping requirements that not only do you have to justify, removing PPE under these circumstances, but you have to sign your name to it and provide the rationale and evidence that goes along with that.
Thanks. Yes, that's perhaps a useful thing. There are documentations requirements in the standard as it is, but yes, adding a justification, as it were, for not using certain sections would be a useful part of the documentation as well. Yeah, thanks. And yeah, be perhaps useful to talk about that more as well, if we can. Yeah, thanks.
So I see Dorothy's posted in the chat box. It would be really great if this revised standard could be presented to the group with the health and safety agencies, departments, representatives, CAALL, to push for uptake of this addition in all health and safety laws, regulations. For example, Manitoba's last update ignored the 2018 edition. And then she said, would CSA do it? And I guess CSA have their mandate and their scope of work, and they can only go so far. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Simon.
That sounds like a great idea. And so I have to mention that, like many people on this call, I'm a volunteer with CSA. I don't represent the organisation, so I can't speak to what it might do. But certainly, again, there's discussion on training right now, and as well to bring it further into the community. Yes, I'm concerned. If it's possible to do more detailed presentations on the standard, particularly on the final version, because of course we're still in the draft stage right now. That would be very useful, I think. Yes, to get better uptake. Yeah.
Okay. And I see. Thanks, Simon. I see Kimberly O'Connell's got a hand raised. Did you want to ask the question, Kimberly?
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay. I got the kitchen background on here. I'll try to change it for you so you don't have to see the cupboards. Yeah, thank you. Good to see you, Simon. I'm sorry I missed the first part of it's March Madness over here, to Dorothy's point, actually. And I was able to share that the CSA standard was out for commentary with all the occupational health and safety system partners. I still got my kitchen. So I'm hoping they are taking the opportunity. I know the Public Services Health and Safety Association also was looking at it. Unfortunately, the timeline is tight for some of what the request is, but they are aware through the Occ Illness Prevention Steering Committee, all of the Ontario anyway, health and safety system partners. I was, and I provided all that there. I did want to again thank you and Kevin and all the team for all this work and today's presentation. And the other thing I'm grateful for, Simon, is the use of, we're also highlighting this with the AIHA and the exposure and control banding committee work. So I know that you had written a synergist, or hoping to write a synergist article around this CSA standard and get that in the pipeline. I'm not sure if there are other efforts there, but it would be great. And and actually having, again, behind the 8 ball, but the CRBOH newsletter is another potential avenue. But again, without having the dates and when they were coming out, now it's due end of March, it's hard to get the planning in, to get some of the support in. So it's nice. It's nice to, doesn't, but at least we can share what gets completed. Yeah.
So thanks. Yeah, certainly there's two aspects. One is getting the input right now for finalising the standard, but once it is finalised and published, then yes, to spread the word further as well, to get it further uptake.
Yeah.
And certainly yes, there's a synergist article on the previous version, or the performance standard back in November, certainly it's feasible to do one on this update as well, and to share as much as we can the news about it, and particularly say with the healthcare guidance, we would like to get a team together. It probably would need to be, I'm sorry, going back to things Marcus said, if we do produce a healthcare guidance document, it's probably best is led by a MD doctor to get better recognition, better acceptance in the healthcare community, rather than by a non-occupational hygiene or non-personal. Inorganic chemist by training, so I'm really not
an occupational health nurse as well. Yeah.
Yes. So it's that sort of thing. We still have to think in those terms, but it would be great to get input, particularly for the guidance side of things, and for people who speak, as it were, the language of healthcare, and to make sure we're thinking in their terms as well. Thanks. Yes.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks. And just on that, up until a couple of days ago, I thought that the 18th of March was a hard deadline. But what I'm hearing is if people still have comments, they can actually provide comments up until the end of the month. But it's still good to get in and have a look at the standard and understand what's in it. Just to get your head around it, and please provide comments. So I'm just wondering, would you mind providing a bit of an update of the feedback that you've got so far, and who's provided feedback? Like maybe there's a lot of detail there, but maybe you could just provide an indication of who's getting back to you on the standard.
Oh, yeah, I can't very easily, I'm afraid, because I'm not privy to it.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry, my access to that website is the same as anybody else's. We as some of the committee have contacted other people directly. So and got some feedback sort of personally from them, as it were, around that. And so I know, for instance, Lisa Brosseau, probably a name known to many people as a North American respirator expert, has made some very comprehensive comments on it, and it'd be useful to look at them. Dave Zalk as well. He's really one of the fathers of control banding as a method. He's had some comments on it too. So we're getting, I think, very useful feedback from very knowledgeable people about the standard. So there is some coming in. I know that, but apologies. No, I'm not privy to the CSA system at all. So
it's
I don't know exactly how many or what's been received. Yeah.
Good reminder, and sorry for the question. I should have known that too. So I see Val. Val has her hand up, or she had a hand up. I think she still wanted to ask a question. Val.
Hi, sorry. I was thinking, Mark, I've been thinking since your presentation about the whole, it's the whole science versus evidence-based medicine and why on earth should there be a versus in that, right? But I'm also wondering about, from I guess a culture question. I think you're actually affiliated with the vet school at Calgary, and I haven't been in a veterinary practice, but I've been in a dental practice. And I have found them to still be very attentive to the risks of COVID generally. Everyone is wearing some kind of mask, and the dentists are wearing respirators. There's air cleaners in every room. The air quality isn't bad when I take my AirNet. I was wondering about veterinarians, and then I'm also wondering about just the culture, I guess, of places that deal with sort of pathogens as a pathogen, as opposed to this sort of, infectious disease prevention, and then all the, whatever swirling attitudes around that seem to be going on in medicine, kind of led by the infectious disease group, as well as, I guess, public health not taking pathogens as seriously as other professions. So anyways, long-winded question, just wondering about comments, and also is there a way that we can take where it's, professions where attention is being paid, and try and shift medicine a little bit? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so first off, I'm not a clinician, so I'm married to one, and I have a lot of contacts with other ones, but I'm not like a kind of primary expert in that area. But I would say, certainly my understanding is that things like airborne aerosol spread are much less controversial in the veterinary space, and I think that's just a consequence of the fact that you deal with these barns, and the animals are in a fixed location, and this animal was sick, and now that animal is sick, and you can't say, well, maybe they had coffee together, or something like that. And so I think it's just been much more obvious and is less controversial in the veterinary space. I think part of the issue is that there's been a lot, if you like the whole story around Nancy Olivieri, who would actually be a great guest to have on sometime to talk about some of these issues, but exemplifies a really long-running issue with medical hierarchies, right? So it's the organizational structure, again, not necessarily the specific individuals, but the way that things are organized. That results in someone very senior can form an opinion, and they kind of push it downwards a little bit, and people feel like maybe they need to comply with that, and they then push it downwards a little bit as well. And what comes out is something that maybe has a ton of signatures on it, but gives the appearance of being the consensus opinion of a whole bunch of people who maybe know what they're talking about, but actually maybe just goes back to somebody senior enough had an opinion, right? And never really even justified it on the basis of evidence or anything, but cascaded it downwards. And so I think, part of the issue is just interdisciplinarity, right? Like the problem isn't necessarily that, there's a lack of expertise or something like that. It's that when public health carried out its decision-making, a very, very narrow subset of the essential expertise and evidence was involved in making those decisions. And if we were to go and we were to have access to all the records, and we were to look for the due diligence behind those decisions, I'm not even sure it exists, right? And incidentally, if anyone's in position to do that for their local health authority or hospital or health region or province or whatever, to go and have a look for the due diligence, I would love to hear whether it even exists for these organizations. So I think what we need is interdisciplinary decision making. And I mean, one of the things that Simon mentioned when they were talking about, pulling together the process for revising these standards is the involvement of people from outside, right? It isn't just the same 5 people sitting around in a room saying, oh, we did a great job last time, let's do the same thing again. It brings in, it's a consultation process. And similarly, engineering, if you look at the engineering disciplinary processes and things like that, there is involvement, members of the lay public and outside specialists and things. And right now, public health, infectious disease decision-making doesn't work that way. It really seems to be a narrow group of insiders that just sort of decide things and push it outwards. So I think that's where the change needs to come. I'll just mention too, while I've got the mic, Ken Zarechansky made a question that I think maybe is more in line with Simon's presentation, but I might have gotten lost up the chat thread.
Okay.
Which question is that? Sorry, Mark. What one? Did I miss it?
It was about treating
components that can be sprayed. Yes. Is that the one? Components that can be sprayed on a mask?
Yeah, that was the one I was thinking.
Okay. Well, you said mask. I think in your question, perhaps we could talk about respirators generally. Well, yes is the answer. That there are what you might call biocides that can be incorporated onto the fabric of the in most cases respirator where it's been tried. And I have to say, having been in the business more than 30 years now, we've seen a lot of these over time, and they're always the next best thing. Unfortunately, there are some issues that arise. So we've seen things like iodine, silver, various acids, bases, certain organic biocides, and so on that have been applied. One issue with these is that the certification standards don't really take them into account. So when you're just looking at direct filtration, passing particles through the material and testing downstream concentration, sort of the kill, as it were, folks kill if some kill is going on like this, it isn't factored in. So basically the respirators have to be good anyway to the N95 or higher level, with or without that material added. So there's a sort of lack of incentive to add it. The other thing can be obviously the kill time. They may not act fast enough for material passing right through. There may be problems with leaching or contamination if someone's handling the product. If you have something, it's like a chemical coating on there, it could be a concern, even if it is killing the product, sort of sitting on the respirator. The one area it may be useful, say, is consider doffing and donning, where you don't want to again get some infection picked up by touching the respirator, but generally proper procedure will be not to touch the respirator fabric itself. So the straps are the area you might be concerned about in that case. There have been a number, and I even saw during COVID there were researchers and companies getting grants to make this wonderful new process. I don't think there are any on the market, even after 30 years of seeing these things being proposed. I don't know if you'll find any of them being sold right now. There are a few trying nanotechnology, but I think they kind of got pulled fairly quickly. So it's not, unfortunately, partly due to the standards, partly due to the application, it's not been a successful thing to do. The one area where it might be useful is in installed filters, where you have a ventilation system filter that might accumulate organic material as it's used, and you might get mold growth on the filter material itself, the filter fabric. That is one case where that sort of system would be useful. But I think for the filtering face piece and other types of respirator, there's probably very limited application for that. And I'm sorry to say, because it's a nice idea, but practically every time it seems to hit roadblocks, and say I don't think there is any systems being sold right now. So thanks. Yeah.
So Simon, I'm just going back to the chat, and there's the very first comment there is from Cheryl, and this really goes to the heart of the problem. She's saying that there is a COVID outbreak at Trinity Village Retirement Home in Kitchener right now. It is not over. So I don't know if you can add anything to that, Cheryl. If you mind unmuting yourself and showing yourself, it'd be interesting to know a bit more about that. Whether respirators are actually used by workers in this retirement home right now. Can you comment on that and just share your thoughts?
I believe they are wearing surgical masks, but I can't confirm that. It is a retirement home. I'm also aware of an influenza A outbreak in another retirement home here in KW, and 8 people have gone to hospital in that outbreak. I don't know what respiratory protection is being worn by the staff there, so that's all I can tell you right now.
Thanks for the comment. And we don't know what the situation is there, but the ideal situation would be that the workers provided with respirators, and they're fit tested. So I'm not sure if Kimberly had a hand up again. Did you have your hand up again, Kimberly, or was that left over from before?
Yeah, it is up again. It was around the good tabling that Val had brought and the discussion with Mark and Simon resulting. And I think it's interesting that we even need to delve really more into psychology at this point, because there is such distrust of science, right? A mistrust of science. And I just loved Mark's commentary. I didn't catch his whole presentation, but around, having us realize people are just people and they might have areas of expertise, but when, it's about knowledge mobilization and plain language and modeling behavior, and to Val's point about her dentist versus JP's comment about another dentist, and I think we need to make objective evidence-based science, that we stop being this who's smarter than who and who has what initials behind, and that's not working. It's actually going the wrong way. It's populism is working. We can see it in everywhere, good, bad, and ugly, right? So it's really about bringing this in every corner with our behavior, with trusted people because of who they are. Alec, you're an amazing example of that, right? Because people have trusted things that you've had to say, and you speak in the words that they are familiar with hearing. All of you are doing that, and I just want to give kudos out to that, and to that commentary, and to Val tabling that. Is that I think we have to stop trying to be right and sound smarter than everybody else, and really just have the conversations, and let people ask the questions, and model and find different ways to communicate than we're doing.
Yeah, just to chime in there, I think that's a critical distinction between sort of legitimate science and people that are attempting to use credentialism to just to back up opinions. Including the things I said in my presentation, they might be right and they might be wrong, but whether they're right or wrong has nothing to do with the fact that I can put doctor in front of my name. They've got to be right or wrong on the facts, and we need to get back to this idea that the point of science is openness and transparency, and that anyone is entitled to look into the evidence and say, well, hang on a minute, you said 2 + 2 is 5, but that it doesn't add up that way. And so I would say definitely use that as a sort of filtration mechanism, right? If you see somebody using excessively complex language, trying to make things sound complicated, sound inaccessible, sound like it belongs to them because of their title, whatever it may be, and that you're not allowed to have an opinion, you're not allowed to ask, well, does that really make sense? Like, are you sure about that? That's a red flag. If you see that, automatically be a little bit suspicious about what they're telling you.
Great comments. So we're kind of 1 minute to 3 at the moment. And I see a colleague from Australia, Peter Knight, is on the call as well. And I know Simon knows Peter pretty well. So Peter's pretty well linked into the Australian standard for respiratory protection as well. So I don't know what time it is there, Peter. Thanks so much for joining us all. And I don't know if anybody else has any closing comments, whether you do, Val. But, just before that, I just really want to thank you both so much for spending your precious time with us and sharing your thoughts today. And it's so important that we all science knowledge activists, and we can actually take this information and we share it with our peers and hopefully influence the influencers. Thanks. And thanks to Val also for being the person behind the scenes here. I don't know if you had anything to add to this, Val, before we close out.
Oh, well, one thing I was thinking was around even people in medicine, I think, are somewhat fatalistic, partly because I think there's such an array of things that can harm people now, and they're inundated to some extent. But I also think, even, you know, riffing off of Alec and Kimberly, that I think it's just having people understand that these little things, which aren't little things, wearing a respirator, we appreciate, and wearing one that fits you tightly, and wearing and understanding the elevated risk situations and being more careful in those, and doing things outside and opening windows, all those things, the whole layers of protection. It's trying to get to make that seem less daunting too, I think, as opposed to it's this big, you know, whatever paradigm that people have to battle against. It's trying that, and that's what we're trying to do here, I think, is to keep people aware that COVID itself and its long-term impacts on workers, on workplaces, on individuals, on families, is still a big concern, and that there are things we could do about it. And the respirators are a very key part of that, so that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater in terms of, you know, understanding the protections that and how to do the risk assessment, like the new standard is offering, and then applying that to our life in all its different dimensions. So otherwise, I do want to also say thanks to Simon and to Mark, and offer them each a chance for any final comments. Thanks, everybody. Mark, do you have something you want to?
No, just thank you very much for hosting. I think this kind of, you know, community building and encouraging people to get engaged in it rather than just be kind of receiving information from on high is super healthy and exactly what we need as a society.
Thanks, Mark. Simon, we might have lost him. I can't see him anymore. Maybe he's
No, I
dropped
don't see
out.
him either. We should
Am I
all.
here? Can you hear me?
Yep, we hear you.
Yes.
We don't see you.
I'm sorry. I lost my connection. I had to rejoin. Sorry about that. But no, thanks very much again for having us. Thank you everyone for participating as well, and to get so many interested people in this. It's absolutely excellent, and look forward to receiving comments and seeing what people have to say. And if there are any questions, you can pass on to me. I'd be happy to answer as well in the meantime. So thank you very much again for having me.
Thanks again. Just a final closing comment from me. When you're advocating for the standard to be accepted, adopted, applied in legislation, it has to be used in its entirety. It's a package. It's a program. It's a respiratory protection equipment program that's important. So all of the elements of the standard should apply, and it shouldn't be cherry picked. So just on that note, I will close out, and unless you had something else to add, Simon, to that point.
It was just to follow up with something actually Barry Hunter put it in the comment, and something I missed in that annex around healthcare is that it does indicate the precautionary principle must be applied, and that occupational health and safety legislation is predominant. That's probably a factor. Maybe it's a bit more of a stick than a carrot to get the thing used, but that's in there as well. So to remind people on that. So thanks.
Great, fabulous. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Mark and Simon, and everybody who's joined in. And hope you do something with this information and share it widely. Thanks again.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.